In the context of modern broadcasting, the concept of an on-screen ambush has become increasingly relevant, particularly with the rise of live television and unscripted segments that favor spontaneous reactions. At its core, an on-screen ambush refers to the act of confronting a guest or presenter with unexpected or deeply personal information during a live broadcast or recorded segment, without prior consent or preparation. These moments may be designed to elicit strong emotional responses, often for the purpose of generating shock value or viral engagement. However, beneath the surface of entertainment lies a more complex psychological and ethical dilemma, one that affects both the individuals involved and the viewers who witness the event. On-screen ambushes are rooted in a media culture that often prioritizes ratings and viewer retention over emotional integrity. Producers and hosts may engineer these moments under the guise of spontaneity or authenticity, believing that real human emotion will captivate an audience more than rehearsed content. While this may be true from a metric standpoint, it introduces a critical concern about the cost of such emotion, particularly when it comes at the expense of another person's dignity, safety, or mental health. Unlike traditional interviews, which are typically structured around mutual understanding and informed consent, ambushes intentionally bypass the subject's right to emotional preparation. This lack of consent is what transforms a surprising moment into a potentially harmful one. When someone is ambushed on screen, the effects can be immediate and visceral. Physiologically, the body responds to sudden emotional stress with the activation of the sympathetic nervous system, commonly known as the fight, flight, or freeze response. This biological reaction can manifest as stammering, flushed skin, confusion, or complete shutdown. The individual may struggle to maintain composure, especially if the topic at hand touches on past trauma, personal relationships, or public controversy. Moreover, because the event is happening in real time, the individual is forced to process complex emotions in front of an audience, often with cameras capturing every micro-expression. This creates a perfect storm of vulnerability and exposure that can lead to lasting psychological consequences, such as anxiety, embarrassment, or mistrust of the media. From an educational perspective, it's important to recognize the power dynamics at play in such scenarios. The person initiating the ambush, whether a producer, co-host, or interviewer, holds control over the narrative. They are usually aware of the content being introduced and often guide the conversation toward a predetermined climax. The ambushed individual, on the other hand, is placed in a reactive position. They are not only uninformed but also expected to respond appropriately within a very short time frame, all while under public scrutiny. This imbalance of power is not just unprofessional. It can be perceived as coercive, particularly when it involves sensitive or potentially humiliating information. Another layer to consider is the long-term impact on the individual's personal and professional reputation. Public figures, when confronted unexpectedly, are often judged not only by what they say, but by how they appear to emotionally handle the moment. A calm reaction may be praised, while visible distress might be misinterpreted as guilt, weakness, or instability. These interpretations can have serious consequences for public perception and career trajectory, especially in today's fast-paced digital landscape where clips are shared widely and interpreted without context. The Internet does not easily forget, and neither does the court of public opinion. Equally concerning is the impact such ambushes have on the audience. Viewers may initially respond with intrigue or curiosity, but over time, exposure to these confrontational tactics can desensitize them to the ethical implications of such behavior. When shock becomes normalized, empathy can diminish. There is a danger in teaching audiences to view emotional distress as entertainment, rather than as a human response worthy of compassion and respect. Furthermore, Younger viewers may internalize the message that violating emotional boundaries is acceptable if it produces dramatic results. This normalizes relational manipulation and reduces emotional intelligence. In educational terms, understanding on-screen ambushes requires us to think critically about media literacy. We must examine not only what we are shown, but how and why we are shown it. We must question the motivations behind programming choices and consider the ethical frameworks, or lack thereof, that guide them. Recognizing ambush tactics helps viewers become more discerning consumers of media and supports the cultivation of a media environment that values emotional integrity over momentary spectacle. In conclusion, on-screen ambushes are more than dramatic television moments. They represent a convergence of media strategy, psychological manipulation, and ethical ambiguity. As viewers, content creators, and educators, it is our responsibility to recognize these dynamics and advocate for a broadcasting culture that respects emotional safety, informed consent, and human dignity. The psychological impact of an on-screen ambush cannot be understated. When someone is unexpectedly confronted with personal, controversial, or emotionally sensitive information during a live or recorded broadcast, the effects are not limited to the moment itself. Instead, such experiences can leave a lasting imprint on the emotional and psychological well-being of the individual involved. This dynamic is especially potent because the ambush occurs in a highly public context, often with cameras rolling, an audience watching, and limited opportunities to pause or regain control. To fully grasp the psychological consequences of such a moment, it is essential to understand the intersection between human emotion, public exposure, and media pressure. When faced with an on-screen ambush, the body reacts as if it is under threat. This reaction is not merely metaphorical but biological. The brain quickly activates the amygdala, triggering the fight or flight response. Cortisol and adrenaline levels rise, preparing the individual to either confront or escape the perceived threat. However, unlike private settings where someone might retreat or process emotions in solitude, a live broadcast denies this option. The individual must remain present, often attempting to mask their real feelings while simultaneously navigating shock, confusion, or even betrayal. This tension between internal chaos and external composure creates psychological friction which can have both short-term and long-term effects. One of the most immediate emotional consequences of an ambush is the experience of humiliation. Being exposed or put on the spot in front of an audience, especially when the topic is personal, can trigger feelings of shame. Shame differs from guilt in that it attacks the self rather than the behavior. The individual may begin to feel as though they have lost control over their identity, that others are now defining them through the lens of a moment they did not consent to. This erosion of personal agency is psychologically destabilizing, particularly when it involves the betrayal of trust by a co-host, interviewer, or producer who was expected to maintain a safe and professional environment. Following the event, many individuals may experience rumination, repeatedly reliving the moment, analyzing what they could have said or done differently. This mental replay can interfere with sleep, focus, and emotional regulation. In cases where the ambush reveals highly sensitive or unresolved emotional wounds, the experience may even trigger symptoms of acute stress or post-traumatic stress, particularly if the individual has experienced previous trauma. In these cases, the ambush does not simply create a new wound, it reopens old ones. From a psychological standpoint, such experiences can also cause damage to self-esteem. Individuals may begin to doubt their worth, their communication skills, or their ability to protect themselves in high-pressure environments. They may question their trust in others, especially those who were involved in orchestrating or enabling the ambush. This breakdown in trust can affect both personal relationships and professional collaborations, sometimes leading to withdrawal, isolation, or even a reluctance to appear on media platforms again. The long-term result is a diminished sense of confidence and self-security. It is also important to consider the social anxiety that may follow an ambush. Because the event unfolds publicly, many individuals develop a fear of being judged or misunderstood by the audience. This fear can escalate into social avoidance, where the person becomes hesitant to engage in public speaking, interviews, or any setting where they are not in full control of the narrative. The uncertainty of how others perceive them adds an additional layer of psychological stress, one that is difficult to address without therapeutic intervention or conscious self-healing practices. Moreover, there can be a cumulative effect when such experiences are not acknowledged or processed. The individual may internalize the belief that their boundaries do not matter, or that their emotions are less valid than public entertainment. This internalization can lead to chronic anxiety, depression, and a persistent sense of vulnerability. Over time, the emotional resilience of the person may weaken, leading to burnout or emotional numbness, a coping mechanism that, while protective in the short term, is unsustainable and unhealthy over the long term. In the educational context, it is critical to raise awareness about these psychological consequences. Emotional well-being should not be sacrificed for momentary television drama or viral clips. Instead, media professionals should be trained to recognize the signs of psychological distress and practice informed consent when planning content that may provoke strong emotional responses. Viewers, too, must be encouraged to look beyond entertainment and develop empathy for those who find themselves at the center of these confrontational moments. Ultimately, the human mind is not designed to process trauma under the scrutiny of cameras and millions of spectators. When on-screen ambushes occur, they do not merely entertain. They leave lasting psychological fingerprints. By understanding the depth of these impacts, society can begin to shift toward a more humane, respectful, and psychologically informed media culture. Louise Hay's teachings offer a deeply transformative approach to emotional healing and personal empowerment. Her work is grounded in the belief that our thoughts shape our experiences, and that by changing our internal dialogue, we can heal not only emotionally, but also physically and spiritually. In the context of emotionally jarring experiences such as public confrontation or on-screen ambushes, her philosophical framework becomes a practical toolkit for regaining inner stability, self-worth, and peace. While these teachings were developed in the realm of personal self-help, their relevance extends into high-pressure public environments where individuals are thrust into emotionally vulnerable positions with little warning. At the heart of Louise Hay's philosophy is the concept of affirmations, positive, present, tense statements that help to rewire negative belief systems and re-establish emotional safety. In moments of emotional chaos, such as being unexpectedly confronted on camera, the mind often reverts to fear-based thinking, "I'm not in control, everyone is judging me, or I can't handle this." These thoughts, while understandable, only serve to amplify distress. Hay's approach encourages a conscious pivot away from those fear narratives towards self-supportive ones, such as "I am safe," "I am centered," and "I trust myself to respond with grace." These affirmations may seem simplistic at first glance, but their repetition can create powerful neurological shifts that restore a sense of agency and calm. In the case of a public ambush, where a person's emotional equilibrium is abruptly destabilized, Louise Hay's teachings provide a critical reminder: no matter what is happening externally, we have the ability to choose our internal response. This is not to suggest that one must suppress or ignore genuine emotions such as fear, anger, or sadness. Rather, it is about creating a mental space where these emotions can be acknowledged without letting them take over. Hay believed that our emotions are messengers, not enemies. By accepting them without judgment and responding with compassion, we begin the process of self-healing, even in the most public and uncomfortable settings. Another core idea in Hay's work is the principle of self-approval. In emotionally charged moments, especially those involving shame or embarrassment, individuals often fall into the trap of self-criticism. They replay the incident in their minds, analyzing their tone, facial expressions, or reactions. This self-surveillance can be deeply harmful. Hay taught that healing begins with self-acceptance. You've been criticizing yourself for years and it hasn't worked. Try approving of yourself and see what happens. For someone recovering from a public emotional challenge, this idea can be a lifeline. Instead of internalizing the judgment of others, they are invited to see themselves through the lens of understanding and unconditional self-love. Louise Hay also emphasized the importance of releasing the past. This is particularly relevant in the aftermath of a shocking or humiliating experience. The human tendency is to cling to painful moments, replaying them in hopes of understanding or control. Yet this repetition only entrenches the emotional pain. Hay's philosophy encourages forgiveness, not just of others, but of ourselves. Through practices such as mirror work, where individuals speak affirmations to themselves in a mirror, or journaling exercises designed to uncover and release old emotional patterns, she offered a roadmap for letting go. In the context of media events that are replayed and scrutinized endlessly online, this teaching is vital. It reminds the affected individual that healing does not depend on public opinion, but on personal intention. Hay's teachings are not rooted in denial or spiritual bypassing. They do not ask people to pretend everything is fine when it isn't. Rather, they offer tools for recentering the self in times of emotional crisis. For example, someone ambushed in a public interview might initially feel powerless, but by applying affirmations such as "I speak my truth with clarity and love," or "I am not defined by one moment," they begin to reclaim their narrative. This shift from victimhood to self-empowerment is central to Hay's approach. In an era where emotional moments are broadcast, dissected, and commented on in real time, the need for inner resilience is greater than ever. Louise Hay's work reminds us that no matter how destabilizing the external world may become, we can always return to the self for grounding. We can choose to speak kindly to ourselves, to honor our emotions, and to grow from every experience, no matter how painful or public it may be. Through her framework, even the most shocking ambush can become a catalyst for healing, self-awareness, and lasting emotional strength. In today's media environment, where real-time broadcasting and viral moments are prioritized, the importance of emotional boundaries has become increasingly overlooked. Emotional boundaries refer to the invisible lines that define where one person's emotional responsibility ends and another's begins. These boundaries allow individuals to protect their mental and emotional well-being by controlling what they are willing to share, experience, or tolerate. However, in the realm of television, talk shows, and news features, especially those that blur the line between journalism and entertainment, those boundaries are often ignored, manipulated, or deliberately crossed for dramatic effect. This becomes especially apparent in the context of on-screen ambushes, where individuals are confronted with unexpected, personal, or provocative content in front of a live audience. Understanding and respecting emotional boundaries is essential for ethical media production, and failing to do so can lead to profound harm. The violation of emotional boundaries on screen usually begins with the element of surprise. A guest or participant enters a conversation expecting one type of interaction, often light, scripted, or professional, only to be blindsided with deeply personal questions or revelations. In some cases, this may involve previously undisclosed information, sensitive accusations, or emotionally charged material related to one's private life. The moment this line is crossed, the individual is no longer operating with informed consent. They have not agreed to engage with the new direction of the discussion, and thus their psychological defenses are breached. This act, whether subtle or overt, constitutes a serious ethical infraction in any media setting that claims to value professionalism and human dignity. Emotional boundaries exist to help people feel safe. They serve as psychological buffers that protect against overwhelm, exploitation, or trauma. When a person's boundaries are disregarded on camera, the experience becomes more than just uncomfortable. It can feel like a form of emotional trespass. The individual may not have the time or space to regulate their feelings, leading to visible distress, anger, or confusion, all of which are then broadcast for public consumption. This not only dehumanizes the person involved, but reinforces a troubling message to viewers that emotional privacy is optional when ratings are involved. The ethical responsibility lies not only with the interviewer or host, but with the entire production team. Producers, editors, and even network executives are part of the decision-making process that leads to these moments. They may argue that such segments are in the public interest, or that they are intended to reveal the truth. However, truth without empathy is often cruelty disguised as journalism. In educational terms, a responsible media environment must be guided by consent, transparency, and respect for personal agency. No revelation, no matter how sensational, justifies manipulating someone's emotional limits for shock value. An emotionally ethical media approach would include clearly defined expectations for all participants. This includes briefing guests ahead of time, providing content outlines, and avoiding the temptation to surprise someone for the sake of entertainment. It also means having protocols in place for when a guest shows signs of emotional overwhelm, such as offering breaks, cutting away from live filming, or offering psychological support after the broadcast. These steps are not just professional courtesies, they are necessities in safeguarding human well-being. The wider implications of boundary violations in media also touch on cultural and societal values. When audiences are routinely exposed to emotionally invasive content, they may become desensitized to the ethical lines being crossed. Viewers may begin to see emotional outbursts or breakdowns as entertainment rather than signals of distress. This normalization of emotional exploitation erodes our collective empathy and sets dangerous precedents for how people treat each other both on and off screen. The more we tolerate boundary violations in media, the more we risk seeing them replicated in everyday life, at work, in schools, and in relationships. Conversely, modeling emotional boundaries on screen can have an incredibly positive effect. When hosts honor a guest's emotional comfort level, when discussions remain respectful, and when consent is prioritized, the content becomes not only informative but uplifting. It teaches viewers the value of emotional intelligence, self-respect, and interpersonal ethics. It also supports healthier long-term relationships between media platforms and their audiences, who learn to trust that they will not be exposed to manipulative or unethical content. Ultimately, the way emotional boundaries are handled in public broadcasting serves as a reflection of the values we hold as a society. Do we prioritize empathy over excitement? Do we honor humanity over ratings? These questions must be asked continuously as media continues to evolve. In navigating the intersection of entertainment and emotional safety, a strong ethical compass is not a luxury, it is a requirement. The role of the audience, both in the studio and watching remotely, has a profound effect on the way emotionally intense media moments unfold, especially in cases involving on-screen confrontation or emotional ambushes. Audience dynamics and public perception don't merely react to what's happening on screen, they shape it. They influence how the participants respond, how the media frames the event, and ultimately how the incident is remembered and interpreted. Understanding this dynamic is key to fostering a more emotionally intelligent and responsible media culture. At the most basic level, human beings are social creatures deeply affected by the gaze and judgment of others. When someone is confronted with an unexpected emotional situation on camera, they're not just reacting to the moment itself, they're reacting to the presence of an audience. That audience might be in a studio, offering real-time reactions through gasps, murmurs, or silence. Or it might be millions of viewers behind screens, whose imagined gaze adds pressure and intensity to the moment. The awareness of being watched heightens vulnerability. It compels the individual to respond in ways that are socially acceptable, even if those responses are misaligned with their internal emotional state. This phenomenon is tied to what psychologists call the looking glass self, the idea that individuals form a sense of self based partly on how they believe others perceive them. In the middle of a public emotional shock, this internal mirror can distort rapidly. A person might feel judged, mocked, misunderstood, or exposed, all of which activate strong emotional reactions such as shame, anxiety, or anger. The presence of an audience, therefore, transforms a private emotional response into a performative balancing act between authenticity and self-protection. Moreover, audience reactions can validate or invalidate the emotional experience of the person on screen. If the audience laughs, claps, or expresses disbelief at an individual's distress, it sends a powerful signal that their emotions are not being taken seriously. This can intensify the feeling of isolation, making the experience even more traumatic. On the other hand, when an audience remains respectful, by listening attentively, reacting empathetically, or even remaining silent, it can create a safer emotional space, even in a highly public setting. These subtle social cues can shape the trajectory of the moment and influence how the individual navigates their response. What complicates this further is the post-event dynamic, where public perception is no longer confined to the live audience. In the digital age, every moment is captured, replayed, dissected, and commented on across social media platforms. Clips go viral, opinions are formed in real time, memes are created. The event becomes larger than the moment itself. It becomes a cultural flashpoint, and the person at the center of it is often stripped of context, reduced to a reaction, a facial expression, or a soundbite. This fragmentation of narrative dehumanizes the individual and replaces complexity with simplicity. Emotional nuance is lost in favor of virality. From an educational standpoint, it's important to highlight how these dynamics contribute to the long-term effects of such events. Public perception has the power to entrench emotional wounds or, alternatively, to support healing. If the wider audience adopts a compassionate and understanding lens, they can contribute to the normalization of emotional honesty and vulnerability in media. But if they choose ridicule or detachment, they reinforce a toxic culture where emotional boundaries are viewed as weaknesses and personal suffering is seen as a spectacle. The media industry plays a crucial role in mediating these audience dynamics. Through careful editing, framing, and commentary, producers can either humanize the individual or further sensationalize their distress. Headlines lower, thirds, tone of voice, and even background music can all influence how audiences interpret what they're watching. Educationally, this calls for greater media literacy among viewers, an understanding that what we see is not always neutral or organic. It's curated, shaped, and often designed to provoke an emotional response. By cultivating awareness of audience influence, individuals can become more conscious consumers of media. They can resist the urge to dehumanize, to jump to conclusions, or to participate in digital dogpiling. Instead, they can ask questions like, what emotional context might I be missing? How would I feel in this person's shoes? What responsibility do I hold as a viewer? In some, the audience is never just a passive observer. They are participants in the emotional ecosystem of every public broadcast. Their reactions ripple through the moment, the aftermath, and even the long-term narrative. When audiences understand their influence, they gain the power to create safer, more respectful media environments, ones where emotional dignity is not sacrificed for entertainment. Emotional literacy and self-regulation are two of the most essential psychological tools for navigating high-stress public scenarios, particularly when one is unexpectedly challenged or confronted in front of an audience. Emotional literacy refers to the ability to recognize, understand, and articulate one's own emotions and those of others, while self-regulation is the ability to manage those emotions constructively. These skills are not innate. They are learned and practiced, and they serve as the foundation for resilience in emotionally volatile environments, including those found in media appearances and live interviews. When someone is caught off guard in a public setting, particularly when facing a personal or provocative question that was not previously disclosed, the body and mind can enter a stress state. Physiologically, this can trigger the fight-or-flight response. The heart races, adrenaline spikes, breathing becomes shallow, and cognitive clarity diminishes. In such moments, the absence of emotional regulation skills can result in emotional outbursts, panic, shutdown, or reactive behavior that may later be regretted or misinterpreted. From an educational perspective, learning to name and normalize these physiological and emotional responses is the first step toward reclaiming control in the moment. Emotional literacy begins with internal awareness. A person who has practiced emotional self-inquiry might recognize thoughts such as, "I feel unsafe," or "I'm being blindsided," and accurately identify the associated emotions, perhaps fear, confusion, or betrayal. This identification is key. Without labeling the emotion, it remains a vague and overpowering experience. Once named, however, the emotion becomes something one can work with. For example, realizing, "I'm feeling humiliated right now," offers more clarity than simply experiencing the overwhelm. With this awareness comes a choice, how to respond to the emotion rather than react from it. Self-regulation builds on this foundation. It involves using tools, mental, physical, or verbal, to calm the nervous system and make deliberate choices under pressure. Techniques might include taking a slow breath, briefly pausing before responding, repeating an internal affirmation, or redirecting the conversation. For instance, someone who senses a rising panic might mentally affirm, "I am allowed to pause," or "this moment does not define me." These small internal shifts can prevent the cascade of panic or reactivity and enable the individual to remain composed in the face of external pressure. One powerful application of self-regulation is the strategic use of silence. In a live media situation, silence is often feared as it can be misinterpreted as a lack of preparation or vulnerability. However, when used intentionally, silence can assert control. Taking a moment to breathe, think, and ground oneself signals strength rather than weakness. It communicates emotional maturity and allows space for the individual to choose their words carefully rather than being swept up in the intensity of the moment. Another crucial self-regulation strategy is boundary setting. If a question or confrontation crosses a personal boundary, especially one that was not agreed upon beforehand, the individual has the right to assert that boundary in a calm, direct way. Phrases such as, "I wasn't prepared to discuss this topic today," or "I'd prefer to continue with the original agenda," are not signs of avoidance. They are expressions of agency and emotional responsibility. Emotional literacy empowers people to know what is acceptable to them, while self-regulation gives them the tools to communicate those boundaries respectfully and confidently. From a broader educational standpoint, these skills are not just useful in media contexts. They are transferable to everyday life. Job interviews, family disagreements, public speaking, or any moment when emotions run high and composure is vital. They foster emotional intelligence, reduce impulsivity, and improve interpersonal relationships. More importantly, they give individuals a sense of self-trust, the belief that no matter what happens, they have the tools to respond with integrity and calm. In moments of public confrontation or surprise, the temptation is often to react defensively or emotionally. But emotional literacy teaches that all emotions are valid, and self-regulation reminds us that not all emotions need to be acted upon immediately. Together, these skills allow for a thoughtful pause, a space between stimulus and response. In that space lies the power to choose dignity over drama, clarity over chaos, and authenticity over performance. Ultimately, developing these emotional competencies is not about suppressing feeling. It's about creating a safe inner environment where emotions can be acknowledged without being overwhelmed by them. In an age where public scrutiny is constant and emotional ambushes are often broadcast and replayed, the ability to remain emotionally literate and self-regulated is not just advantageous, it is essential.